What Danielle Smith is doing right now could become one of the most dangerous political risks Canada has faced in years. At the exact moment Mark Carney is trying to unlock massive economic opportunities for Alberta, pipelines, energy expansion, infrastructure investment, exports, and thousands of jobs, Smith has once again pushed separation politics back into the national spotlight. And honestly, what makes this situation even more explosive is that many political analysts now believe this is no longer truly about Alberta's future. Increasingly, it looks like a strategy focused on protecting Danielle Smith's own political survival. As political analyst Scott Reed pointed out, Smith had a critical choice in front of her: help Alberta strengthen its position within Canada's economy, or focus on keeping her political base united through division politics. According to him, she chose the second path. And that accusation carries huge consequences. Because while Mark Carney is attempting to steady the country during rising pressure from Donald Trump, global uncertainty, and economic instability, Danielle Smith is escalating rhetoric that could scare investors, weaken national confidence, and deepen internal fractures across Canada. And the timing could not be worse. Global companies are already watching Canada closely before committing billions into future energy and infrastructure projects. Investors want stability, predictability, and long-term confidence, but Alberta's premier is now injecting political uncertainty directly into the middle of that conversation. Even more telling, both the Alberta Chamber of Commerce and the Canadian Chamber of Commerce have publicly raised concerns about this referendum strategy. That alone shows how serious the backlash has become. Because this is no longer just political drama. This is becoming a real debate about whether one leader's effort to preserve internal political support could end up hurting Alberta's economy, damaging Canada's unity, and creating exactly the kind of instability Trump's America would benefit from seeing north of the border. So if you haven't already, subscribe to I Love Canada, because tonight we're breaking down why Danielle Smith's referendum strategy is triggering growing concern across the political spectrum, and why Mark Carney is now facing one of the toughest balancing acts of his leadership so far.
I think it's almost entirely about her own political position, because the reality is she could spend all of her efforts trying to keep Alberta within Canada, try to keep Alberta and Canada moving forward, or she could spend her efforts trying to keep her own job, trying to keep contained that portion of her political coalition that wants to separate, and she has chosen to do the latter with this question, this confused and contradictory question that has unleashed all this this pushback from both sides of the political spectrum, from all sides of the political spectrum. But I think it is an example of a leader, frankly, trying to manage an intramural political challenge that she has. And in the course of doing so, she's put a great number of other things at risk.
The biggest contradiction inside Danielle Smith's strategy is now becoming impossible to ignore. For years, Alberta Conservatives argued that Ottawa was the obstacle, blocking pipelines, slowing development, and refusing to support Alberta's economy. But now, under Mark Carney, the federal government is signaling something very different: openness to major energy projects, infrastructure expansion, pipeline discussions, and deeper economic cooperation with Alberta. So naturally, many Canadians are now asking the obvious question: if Alberta is finally getting a federal government willing to engage seriously with its economic priorities, why push separation politics now? And that is exactly why more critics are beginning to believe this has less to do with Alberta's long-term interests and more to do with Danielle Smith's internal political pressures. Because while separatist voices in Alberta may be loud online and politically active, broader support for leaving Canada still appears limited, and even Smith herself seems aware of that reality. Yet instead of calming tensions, she continues amplifying the rhetoric. And politically, that is an extremely risky game, because massive infrastructure projects are not built on speeches or political emotion alone. They are built on investor confidence. Companies investing billions into pipelines, energy corridors, manufacturing, exports, and industrial expansion need one thing above all else: stability. They need certainty about the political and economic environment they are committing their money into. But the moment a premier begins raising questions about Alberta's future inside Canada, uncertainty immediately enters the equation. Investors start hesitating, markets start questioning long-term stability, and business leaders begin worrying about political risk. That is why chambers of commerce and major industry groups are becoming increasingly uncomfortable with this referendum debate. Because whether separatist support is large or small, the conversation itself introduces instability into Alberta's economic future. And ironically, that instability could end up undermining the exact investment, growth, and development opportunities Alberta has been demanding from Ottawa for years.
This all comes shortly after the Prime Minister has been working to improve relations between the federal government and Alberta. How does this threaten his goals?
Well, on the first pass, it's a threat because, by her own confession, this could unleash 2.5 years of clear uncertainty. What have the Premier and the Prime Minister been working at? Trying to get major projects moving, a pipeline, other energy infrastructure. What does that require? A private sector company to come forward and say, we're going to spend tens of billions of dollars, commit to putting that money on the table. But who's going to come forward in this climate of uncertainty when you don't even know if the jurisdiction you might be investing in could then be seeking to leave the Federation? So the first problem with it is that it's going to discourage business investment. You don't have to believe me. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce, the Alberta Chamber of Commerce has spoken out against this tortured question.
What makes this entire situation so politically delicate is the position Mark Carney now finds himself in. Because if Ottawa responds too aggressively to Danielle Smith's rhetoric, it risks fueling separatist anger even further and giving the movement more momentum. But if Carney appears too passive or hesitant, critics could accuse the federal government of looking weak at a moment when national unity is being openly challenged. And that is exactly why Carney's approach has been so carefully disciplined. He's attempting to walk a very narrow political line, defending Canada firmly while also continuing to reassure Albertans that Ottawa is prepared to work with them on investment, pipelines, infrastructure, energy projects, and long-term economic growth. That balancing act is incredibly difficult, especially under current global conditions, because at the very same time Carney is trying to manage rising internal tensions, he is also dealing with increasing economic pressure and hostility coming from Donald Trump's America, which is why many Canadians now see Danielle Smith's escalation of separation politics as particularly reckless timing. Instead of helping strengthen Canada during a period of growing external uncertainty, critics argue she is adding another layer of instability right when the country can least afford it.
So with that said, what approach should the Prime Minister be taking here?
Well, that's a super important question. It's an incredibly delicate question. And those of us that lived through separation wars with the province of Quebec and recall what an awkward spot these kinds of referendum ballots place the federal government in. On the one hand, you look to the federal government, to the Prime Minister, to obviously be the champion of Canada as a project. On the other hand, you know that if you intervene too directly, too forcefully, there's a chance that you will stir up backlash and opponents. The separatist sentiment might be intensified by a federal government that says, what are you talking about? What are all these complaints you're talking about? It's ridiculous. So the Prime Minister has to steer a very careful course. You saw it yesterday. On the one hand, he's saying, there's no question here, let's keep Alberta within Canada. On the other hand, he's promising that he wants to continue to work together, which is a dog whistle for there are benefits to being here. There are benefits to remaining within Canada. So that's the delicate balance he needs to strike.
That is the larger reality now starting to emerge across Canada. This debate is no longer just about Alberta. The moment separation rhetoric returns to mainstream national politics, every province begins paying attention. Other premiers and political movements start asking difficult questions. Does threatening separation suddenly become an effective bargaining strategy? Does political instability now bring leverage? Does Ottawa eventually reward provinces that apply maximum pressure? And that is exactly why the consequences of this debate stretch far beyond Alberta's borders. Because once emotional division politics becomes normalized, controlling where the conversation goes next becomes much harder for the entire country. Which is also why Mark Carney appears to be handling this so cautiously. His tone has remained measured, calm, and heavily focused on cooperation rather than confrontation. Carney seems to understand that once the debate turns fully emotional and reactionary, national unity itself can quickly become harder to stabilize. At the center of this conflict are now two completely different visions for Alberta's future. One vision is centered around stability, investment, national cooperation, energy expansion, pipelines, exports, and building major projects inside a united Canada. The other increasingly depends on referendum politics, pressure tactics, and keeping political frustration alive internally. And right now, those two paths are colliding directly. What makes this moment especially remarkable is that Mark Carney appears more open than many previous federal leaders to giving Alberta several of the economic opportunities it has demanded for years. Major energy projects, infrastructure expansion, export growth, and deeper national cooperation. Yet despite that, the separation rhetoric continues intensifying. And honestly, that contradiction is becoming harder to ignore. Because if this fight were only about economic opportunity, Alberta may already have one of the most receptive governments in Ottawa it has seen in decades, which is why more critics are starting to believe this debate is becoming less about Alberta's future and more about Danielle Smith's political survival. And if that assessment is correct, Canada could now be entering one of the most politically volatile phases of this entire debate so far. If you enjoyed this breakdown, subscribe to I Love Canada for more deep analysis on Mark Carney, Danielle Smith, Donald Trump, Alberta politics, Canada-US tensions, geopolitics, and the major political shifts reshaping Canada.